Hello. Thought to have lived about 500 BC, Heraclitus is one of the most important and certainly the most intriguing of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. He is well known in antiquity for cryptic utterances such as "you can never step into the same river twice," which earned him a reputation for obscurity. Another of his celebrated epigrams is, "If you don't expect the unexpected, you won't find it out, since it's not to be found out and pathless." Heraclitus was known as the weeping philosopher, supposedly because of his melancholic view of life. His philosophy is enigmatic, succinct, surprising and profound. With me to discuss Heraclitus are Angie Hobbs, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Senior Fellow in the Public Understanding of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, Peter Adamson, Professor of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy at King's College London, and James Warren, Senior Lecturer in Classics and a Fellow of Corpus Christi College, the University of Cambridge. Angie Hobbs, what do we actually know about Heraclitus?
Well, he was born about 535 and lived to about 475 BC in Ephesus, so a Greek settlement on the coast of Asia Minor. And though it was a Greek settlement, it was by this time part of the Persian Empire, though not happy about that. And in the 490s BC, Ephesus was at the forefront of a rebellion against Persia, so fairly turbulent times. He was born into an aristocratic family. As you said, he had a reputation for being dark or obscure and riddling and rather misanthropic. According to the legends, he didn't have much time for his fellow Ephesians and after a while went off to live in the hills and eat herbs. However, what he did do was lay a copy of his book on nature in the famous Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world at Ephesus, and it quickly gained a cult following. So though he didn't have much time, allegedly, for humanity, he did have a lot of cult followers who called themselves the Heracliteans.
These are the very, very early days, which is one thing that's fascinating about philosophy. Was there an academy that he went to? Was he on his own? Were there people he associated? Do we know anything about his life as a philosopher?
Well, we know that he's part of the first wave of, they would have perhaps seen themselves as natural scientists on the coast of Asia Minor, who are sort of starting to ask big questions about the cosmos and what its basic constituents are and its origin and what the place of humanity is within it. So before Heraclitus, we have people like Thales, there's Anaximenes from Miletus, just along on the coast. They didn't form a school as such. There's no particular, record of any connections between them, but they are part of this flowering, and I think it's no accident that this part of the coast is in the hub of a lot of trade routes. So ideas are flowing between Greece and Egypt and the Babylonian civilizations and back again, and I think that's significant in why they started to ask these questions at about this time.
I'm going to press my extremely mundane question with some embarrassment. I'm not even looking at you, Andrew, while I'm saying this, but I'd really like to know, you mentioned he was aristocratic background, let's say he was well enough off. He just decided to be a philosopher and studied philosophy, and that was what he did off his own bat. There wasn't any structure for it. There wasn't any... Was there a group of them? I'm quite interested to know what they did.
Well, I mean, later in the programme, I'm sure Peter and James will be able to help me. I mean, no, as far as I'm aware, according to the anecdotes, he was pretty much on his own. He wasn't a very clubbable kind of a guy, though he probably did go to the marketplace occasionally in Ephesus and sort of read bits of his book out, and he would have to capture the attention of the passing shoppers, and that might be part of the reason for his very vivid style. No, he is unique.
Peter Adamson, we're told that Heraclitus wrote a book called On Nature. We're then told that title was given way after his death, but that's still more or less referred to as that, these 100 or so aphorisms. Before we talk about that book, this was a time, as I read, of a surge of literacy. Can you just give us that background?
Yeah, that's right. So if we think about the sort of earliest texts to come to us from early antiquity, we think of Homer and Hesiod, for example, and people often talk about the fact that this was presented in oral form. In other words, it would have been recited. In fact, there were people who went around reciting Homer. And in the few centuries during which philosophy is emerging in ancient Greece, and of course ancient Greece here means Greek civilization over the Mediterranean, not just Greece, because, as Angie has just mentioned, actually Heraclitus is from Ionia, which is in modern-day Turkey, not Greece. So across this culture, you have a move from orality to literacy, as we sometimes say. And it's interesting to notice that Heraclitus actually refers to several contemporaries as well as to Hesiod and Homer. So, for example, he refers to Xenophanes, a slightly earlier pre-Socratic philosopher, and he refers to Pythagoras.
But as Angie pointed out, he put his book in this famous temple, so he would have expected enough people to turn up and want to read it.
Yeah, I guess so. So that title, as you mentioned, is something we might be a little bit dubious about. The title On Nature is one that was supposedly used by a lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers. I think we shouldn't be misled by that title. I mean, even if Heraclitus did use it, the word physis, nature, there, doesn't necessarily mean nature in a narrow sense. It might mean sort of everything that there is. And in fact, we're also told by a later source that this work was split into 3 sections: on the cosmos or the universe, on politics, and on theology. But the fragments that we have don't necessarily fit very neatly into those 3 departments. In fact, a lot of them are about philosophical methodology and so on.
Can you tell us what remains of Heraclitus? What are we going to be talking about? What's the basis of this following conversation?
Right, so that's an excellent question to ask about all the pre-Socratics, because we do not have their complete works. What we have is what's usually called fragments, and sometimes testimonia, in other words, reports of what they said. And with Heraclitus, in a way, we might regret that less than with the other pre-Socratic philosophers, because it's almost as if he wrote in fragments, right? He writes these sort of oracular statements. They're riddles. They're very carefully put together. They are structured with rhyme, assonance, wordplay, puns. And that was clearly supposed to be part of their appeal. It also made them very quotable. And so, I mean, it's not clear how On Nature, or whatever this book was structured, or exactly what was in it, but it may have been literally just a collection of these kind of aphoristic sayings.
I've mentioned, and many people know about, you cannot walk into the same river twice. And so can you give us 1 or 2 other examples which display what you talk about, the crafted nature and the use of...
Actually, so maybe I'll just start with that fragment, because I just wanted to quote it in Greek, because you can really hear how nice it is. So I'll tell you what the Greek sounds like, and then I'll tell you the sort of strict translation. So it goes like this: Poitomoisi toisin autoisin embainusin hetera kai hetera hudata epire, which sounds quite nice, right?
Do you want to do it again? But I didn't catch that properly the first time.
Poitomoisi toisin autoisin embainusin hetera kai hetera hudata epire. So I mean, you might also even think it sort of sounds like babbling water, right? And the kind of strict translation, there, by the way, are several reports of this thought from Heraclitus. This one would be translated: over the same rivers, stepping into them, different and different waters flow, or something like that. There's a very strict translation. So the thought is, right, famously, that you can't step into the same river twice, because if you step into a river, step out, step back in again, it's different water. Another example would be...
but also, isn't it, you're supposed to be a different person. You too have changed.
Yeah, right. And in fact, one of the effects of the wordplay is that this idea about whether things are the same could refer to the river or to the person, people sometimes say. I mean, all these things are very difficult to interpret, partially because he plays around with Greek word order. And in fact, there's a passage in Aristotle's Rhetoric where he, kind of with crushing banality, complains that an example of Heraclitus doing this is an example of bad Greek style, because you can't tell which word is supposed to there's this one word which you can't tell whether it's supposed to go with the clause before it or the clause after it. But of course, Heraclitus was doing that on purpose.
And Aristotle was wrong in this case.
A rare event, but yes.
Can you give us the example of the bow and the arrow? And that's an example of his the way he talked about tensions in everything, in particles and in the whole of life.
Yeah, there's actually 2 fragments about the bow, which is maybe telling, because it may be that we're supposed to read fragments in light of each other. So one of them says, and again you have to go to the Greek for this, the word bios means life in Greek, and the word bios, with the stress on the second syllable, means bow, as in bow and arrow. And so what he says, it's a kind of pun and almost a joke. He says the bow its name is life, its work is death. So you get this idea that we'll come across later, that opposite things are coinciding in the same object. And there's another...
And also with the bow and arrow, he says that the two things are happening. You're pushing it forward and you're pulling it back at the same time. You're pulling the string back and you're pushing the bow forward.
Exactly. So that's the other fragment.
Yeah.
The other fragment is that the bow turns back on itself. He also mentions a Greek lyre, which has the same shape. So the idea is that it pulls in both directions at the same time. And in fact, if you think about it, it kind of consists in the fact that it's being pulled in two directions at the same time.
James Warren, Heraclitus has been called a monist, and can you tell us what that means and what his interpretation of that was?
So, to be a monist just means, in this context, that you think there's just one thing. And so there are different kinds of monisms. Some of these predecessors that Angie mentioned are thought of as being what are called material monists, which means that they think that everything that you see around you in the world is basically made out of one kind of matter. So Thales, for example, may have thought that everything was made out of water. Some people think Heraclitus is very similar because he might have thought that everything was basically constructed out of fire. It's certainly the case that he says things like, listening not to me but to my account is one of his fragments. He says it's wise to agree that all things are one. Now, whether that means that things are materially constituted out of one and the same element, or that there's some other sorts of unifying nature to all things, is something that we might want to talk about. But he's certainly a monist of the sort that he sees an underlying unity to the diversity and change that he sees around us in the world.
Why don't you talk about it?
Okay. Well, I think the fragments point, as they often do, in different directions. So one fragment says that the cosmos is an ever-living fire, kindled in measures and going out in measures. And this sounds like a good evidence for him saying, well, everything's basically made out of fire. It can be transformed into different things. So another fragment says fire turns first into sea, and then half of sea turns into earth, and half of earth, and then into storm or something. It's a very difficult word to translate. So he sees, I think, a series of cyclical transformations between the basic constituents in the world. Fire turns into water, water turns into earth, and so on.
Is there any sense that he thinks of fire as the initial starter of the world, as the beginning of the world? The world began in fire. Is there a fragment that suggests that?
That's less clear, in fact. There's some suggestion that he thinks that every so often the world might return to being completely consumed by fire, that it will just be fire. But he certainly thinks of fire as perhaps the most important of the elements, perhaps because it has this clear dynamism and it's to do with his notions of constant change.
Is he talking in fire in terms of flames leaping up, or is he talking of fire in terms of the sun and heat as well?
Well, I would think he would take the sun and heat to be examples of something more basic and more fundamental. So I think he would think the fire in your fireplace is just as much a bit of fire as the fire of the sun too.
There seems to be a dispute about the ordering of these fragments, but people are fairly confident about the introduction.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that introduction?
Well, we're confident about the introduction for two reasons. One, Aristotle tells us it was the first part of the work, and also it just seems like an introduction. It's the longest fragment, and I can tell you what it says if you like.
I would be very pleased if you did.
So this is the bit that Peter mentioned Aristotle failed to understand properly. It starts like this. It says, this account, and the Greek word there is logos, which is an important word for Heraclitus that we'll come back to, I think. This account being always the case, always men fail to understand it, both before they hear and when first they have heard. For although all things come to be according to this account, the men seem to be without experience of it even when they try out all the words and deeds of the kind I set out when I distinguish each thing according to its nature and say how it is. Other men don't pay attention to what they do when they're awake, just as they don't pay attention to what they do when they're asleep.
So he's telling them they're not going to understand what he's going to
Absolutely.
write about.